The knock at the door was polite. 2 sharp raps, a pause, then one more, like someone who didn't want to be rude, just efficient. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and opened it without thinking. The man standing there wore a courier's uniform, clean-shaven, with the kind of smile that said, "This isn't personal." He asked me to sign. I did. Then he handed me a thick envelope and turned away before I could ask anything. It wasn't until I sat back down that I noticed the return address, a law office in the city. My heart stumbled. I knew that name. My brother used that firm when he bought his second condo. I stared at the seal for a long time. I didn't want to open it, but dread has its own gravity. Inside was a notice of eviction. Legal, cold, sterile. It said I had 14 days to vacate the premises. No extension, no negotiation. Attached were copies of transfer deeds I'd never seen before, all signed, all valid. At the bottom in confident black ink was my brother's name, his full name, the one he only used for legal documents and resumes. I read it once, then again. The signature didn't disappear. The ink didn't smear. I pressed the paper to my chest and waited for the room to stop spinning. It didn't. This was the house I grew up in, the house I stayed in when he left for America, the house I maintained, paid taxes on, cleaned, repaired, nursed our father in until his dying breath. I was never told it was no longer mine. I walked to the back door, out into the garden, and sat on the old stone bench by the pond. The koi were still there. They swam in lazy circles, unbothered. I had fed them every morning since our mother died. They didn't know what had just happened. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just sat there feeling the heat of the sun against my back, the cool stone beneath me, and a silence so thick I could barely breathe through it. I don't remember how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. At some point, I realized I was still clutching the letter. I unfolded it again, as if some line had changed. It hadn't. He had done this, my brother, the one I raised almost like a son after our mother passed, the one I sent half my paycheck to while he was in college, the one who once cried in my lap because a girl broke his heart and he didn't know how to be a man. And now, this was how he chose to speak to me, through a lawyer. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept picturing the driver who must have brought the documents to him, the pen he used, the moment he made the decision to send this instead of calling. I wanted to believe there was some mistake, a clause I'd misunderstood, a missing page. But no, it was clean, intentional, brutally precise. He wanted me out, not just from the house, from the story, from the legacy. The next morning, I made tea like I always did. Jasmine, my mother's favorite. I sat at the window, watching the light touch the old furniture, the photo frames, the grooves on the floor made by our father's cane. I could leave. I knew that. I wasn't trapped. But this wasn't about logistics. This was about betrayal in its most refined form, the kind that doesn't scream at signs. I thought of calling him, just to ask why, just to hear him lie to me. But I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear the sound of my name spoken with that new voice of his, the clipped corporate one. Instead, I opened a drawer and took out the folder with my parents' records. I'd never had a reason to look closely before. Everything I needed was in my memory, birthdays, anniversaries, the drawer where my father kept his medals, the crack on the third step that he always meant to fix. But something inside me whispered, "Look." I spent the whole day sifting through paper, birth certificates, death certificates, medical receipts, and beneath them all, an envelope with my name on it in my mother's handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. Not then. I just held it against my chest the way I once held her scarf when she died. The sun had set. The house was quiet, and still I hadn't cried. But something inside me had changed. Something old and soft had hardened. Something buried had begun to rise. The envelope felt warm in my hand, though the room was cold. I turned it over again and again, as if by some magic, the words inside would leak through the paper and save me from what I already knew. My name, written in my mother's careful cursive, was centered perfectly, like a blessing or a warning. She never wrote anything without a reason. I waited until the house was completely dark before I opened it. I lit a candle, just one, and sat on the floor beside the family altar. My knees ached, and the wood creaked beneath me, but I didn't shift. I wanted the pain to stay. I wanted it to mean something. The letter was short, just 3 paragraphs, no date, no signature, but her voice was there alive between the strokes of each letter. If you are reading this, something has happened that I hoped never would. You gave your life to this home, this family. You put your own dreams away, like winter clothes, thinking you'd wear them again someday. I saw you, even when you thought no one did. The tears came, then sudden and silent. I kept reading. Your brother may forget. He may try to rewrite. But I remember. You have always been the one holding this house up quietly, lovingly. If anyone deserves to call it theirs, it is you. I wrote this not for the courts. I wrote it because love should be recorded too, not just deeds and titles and debts. I wrote it so that one day if you are lost, you'll know someone saw you. Someone knew. I folded the letter and placed it in my lap. My breath came in shallow waves. The candle flickered, casting long shadows across the altar where my parents' portraits watched me from their wooden frames. I stayed there until dawn. The next few days moved slowly, like trying to walk through water. I cleaned each room in the house, not because it was dirty, but because it was mine, or had been. I touched everything with the reverence of someone preparing for loss. In the living room, I found the stool where my father used to sit to polish his shoes. In the hallway closet, the jacket my mother wore every winter still hung her perfume, faint but unmistakable. I sat in my old bedroom and opened the window. The wind brought the scent of earth and rain. I could hear the neighbors arguing softly across the street, the whir of a distant lawnmower, the faint hum of a world that had no idea my life had split in two. At night, I dreamt of our childhood, the 3 of us at the dinner table, my father carving pork belly with quiet precision, my mother serving soup with both hands, my brother laughing at something I'd said. We used to be a story that made sense, but even in dreams, the cracks had begun to show. I remembered the first time he left. He had been accepted into a university overseas, and I helped him pack, folded each shirt, slipped extra cash into his suitcase. Our parents couldn't afford to send him alone, so I worked nights for 6 months straight to make it possible. When he left, he promised to come back. Just a few years, he said, hugging me tightly. Then we'll rebuild together. But years stretched, calls became fewer, emails colder. When our father had his stroke, I called and begged him to come home. He said he had meetings, that flights were expensive, that I was strong enough to handle it. And I did. I bathed our father, learned how to manage medications, fought with insurance companies. He sent flowers. When Mother passed away 3 years later, he flew in for exactly 36 hours. He wore sunglasses at the funeral, didn't cry, gave a speech about legacy, then left before I could ask him where he'd been all those years. I told myself he was grieving in his own way, that some people run from pain while others sit beside it. I convinced myself that keeping the house alive was enough for both of us. But maybe he hadn't just run from grief. Maybe he'd run toward something else, something colder, shinier, simpler. The deed transfer was dated just 3 months after our father died, which meant even while I was still settling hospital bills, still washing the bedding, still collecting his ashes, my brother had already been signing things, planning things. I tried to remember the last time he called me just to talk. I couldn't. Instead, I remembered the last message he sent me. Let's keep things civil. I don't want this to get ugly. Not, are you okay? Not, we'll figure this out. Just that. That was when I knew, not hoped, not wondered, knew. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. He didn't want to fight me. He just wanted me gone. And now I had a choice, not about staying. That part was already being decided for me, but about how I would go. I stopped packing halfway through the 3rd box. The books were too heavy, the memories heavier. My hand rested on a spine, worn smooth by years of rereading The Old Man and the Sea, my father's favorite. He used to read it aloud in the evenings, his voice soft, measured, as if every word was a prayer. It was in that room, dim with sunset and dust, that I first realized something I hadn't let myself admit. Until now, I was grieving people who were still alive, not my parents. I had made peace with their passing. But my brother, he was gone in a way that no obituary could ever capture. I kept moving in fragments, methodically, but slowly. Every object I touched had a ghost attached. The chipped porcelain bowl my mother used for rice porridge, the wall where my father marked our heights with pencil. Even the doorframe held the echo of years. It felt like I was dismantling a museum of my own life, carefully erasing myself from the story. On the 4th evening, I sat in the kitchen with a single light on and drank tea in silence. The jasmine tasted bitter. I had taken care of this home through typhoons, power outages, termites, and broken pipes. I had paid bills when my brother couldn't, sold my jewelry to keep the roof over our heads. But the law didn't ask who had stayed. It only asked who had signed. The idea of fighting for the house crossed my mind briefly. I even called a lawyer. She was kind, listened carefully, and then told me the truth. Yes, you may have a case, but it will be slow, expensive, ugly. And if he's already filed for transfer and you weren't listed on the deed well, I thanked her, hung up, sat in the dark for another hour. Was I too proud to fight, too tired, or had I simply come to understand something deeper, that keeping the house wouldn't restore what was already lost? There was a time I would have begged, pleaded, held on to the idea that family could be reasoned with. That truth was enough, but not now. Now all I could feel was the dull echo of conversations that never happened. I remembered the last Lunar New Year we spent together. He and his wife had flown in, late missing the ancestor offering. They brought expensive wine, wore designer clothes, and left their shoes on inside the house, despite knowing better. At dinner, his wife commented on how quaint the house was, said it smelled old. I smiled, bit my tongue, served her soup. Later that night, while washing dishes, I heard her whisper in the hallway, "She'll be gone soon anyway. He'll sort it out." I should have said something then, but silence had become my second skin. The next morning, I found a cracked bowl in the trash. My mother's. No apology. No acknowledgement. I remember staring at the empty spot in the cabinet and thinking, this is how it starts. Quiet theft, disguised as indifference. I hadn't realized then that the theft wasn't of things, it was of place of belonging. A week before my move-out deadline, I stood in the doorway of my parents' bedroom, untouched since they passed. My father's slippers were still beside the bed. My mother's rosary hung by the lamp. I didn't know what to take. Everything felt sacred, yet everything felt like it might turn to ash in my hands. I chose one thing, a faded photograph from 1986, the three of us in front of the house right after the renovation. My mother's arm around my shoulders. My brother grinning, missing 2 teeth. My father behind us holding the paintbrush. We looked like a family. But photographs lie sometimes, or maybe we just outgrow the truth they once captured. I wrapped the photo in cloth and tucked it into my bag. That was all I would take from that room. That night, I had a dream. I was walking barefoot through the garden, but the trees were gone. The pond was empty. The house loomed behind me, dark and hollow. I turned to look for my parents, but only saw my brother standing at the threshold, arms crossed. His face was blank. Then he shut the door. I woke up gasping. The next day, I called the courier company, scheduled my own pickup, arranged for storage. I labeled every box with precision, not because I planned to unpack them soon, but because labeling gave me a sense of control in a world that had taken so much without asking. When the movers came, they were fast, efficient, kind in that detached way people are when they see you going through something, but know better than to ask. By sundown, the house was empty. My footsteps echoed. I walked through each room one last time, touching the walls like they might disappear. In the living room, I whispered goodbye to the light, to the floor, to everything I had kept alive. I locked the door from the inside, then unlocked it again. I left the key on the table and walked out with nothing but a memory. The first night in the rental was so quiet it hurt. No creaks in the floorboards, no hum of the old fridge, no wind tapping the garden gate. Just clean silence, the kind that doesn't comfort you. It reminds you you're alone. The walls were white and unmarked, the curtains still stiff with folds from packaging. I hadn't unpacked a single box. I'd brought them in, stacked them along the far wall, and then sat on the mattress the movers had dropped in the center of the room. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, I was, but the grief had changed texture. It was dry now, dusty, like an old book you're too afraid to open again because you already know how it ends. I boiled water, made tea, jasmine again. It tasted different. Maybe the water here had no memory. I thought I would sleep through the night, exhausted from moving, but my mind wouldn't stop. It rewound, not to the house, but to something earlier, something smaller. I remembered a birthday. I must have been 12. My mother had made mi kwang and set the table with her best dishes. My father had bought me a second-hand book I'd been asking for. My brother, 7 at the time, had made me a card with glitter and glue and spelled my name wrong. He gave it to me with both hands, bowed his head the way he'd seen my father do. I still remember how proud he looked, like he'd given me gold. That was the boy I raised. So how did we get here? I kept asking myself that, over and over. How does love decay like this? What rots it? I wanted to believe it was his wife, that she had changed him, whispered greed into his ear, carved away The boy who once cried when I scraped my knee. But that would have been too easy. No, he made choices, many, over time, small ones that chipped away at something sacred, and I let him. I let him forget who we were, because I kept thinking he'd remember on his own. I didn't see him again after I left. No calls, no messages, just silence, like I'd been deleted from the family story. A week passed, then another. I began to unpack, slowly, one object at a time, a plate, a cup, the photo of our family still wrapped in cloth. I didn't hang it. I placed it in a drawer, not out of anger, out of mercy. I needed space to breathe without ghost watching. One afternoon, I walked to the post office to change my address. The clerk asked me to fill out a form. I paused when I got to the section labeled Previous Residence. I wrote it carefully. Each letter felt like a goodbye I hadn't fully said. When I handed it over, she didn't look up, just stamped it. That's the thing about bureaucracy. It doesn't care who you used to be, only who you are now. On the walk home, it started to rain. Not hard, just enough to soak through my sweater. I didn't run. I let it come. Let it wash the dust from my skin. I stopped by the corner store, bought rice, lemongrass, tofu, cooked a small meal that night, ate it slowly, alone. But something had shifted. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. This place was mine, not inherited, not borrowed, not contested, mine. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, between spoonfuls of warm broth and the ticking of a new wall clock, I felt something I hadn't in months. Not joy, not forgiveness, just space, the kind of space where something new might grow. I stood up, walked to the window, and opened it wide. The city buzzed softly below. Cars, laughter, distant music, and for the first time since the letter came, I whispered something I hadn't dared before. I'm still here. Not much, just 3 words, but they felt like the beginning of a new chapter no one could take from me. A month passed, then another. I marked the days only by the cycle of the moon and the withering of the flowers I bought from the street vendor every Sunday. I didn't call anyone. I didn't explain. I let the silence grow roots. People used to say I was the glue of the family, that without me, the center wouldn't hold. But glue doesn't complain. It just sticks, even when it's cracking. I started waking early, long before sunrise. I liked the stillness, the soft blue light before the world fully remembered itself. I'd brew coffee, sweep the little balcony, and listen to the birds make their announcements to no one in particular. I began writing again, not to publish, just to remember. At first, it was fragments, the smell of my mother's lemongrass soap, the way my father used to hum when he fixed broken fans, the exact shade of blue on our kitchen tiles. Then I wrote about him, about the boy I once held on my hip, about the man who stood in the ashes of our parents' lives and chose to claim what I had rebuilt. I didn't write with anger. I had none left. What came instead was a kind of quiet disbelief, the way one might feel looking at a fallen tree, wondering how something so old and rooted could be gone in a single night. The letter I had found from my mother never left my side. I kept it folded in a velvet pouch inside my drawer beneath my clean clothes. Some nights I read it just to remind myself I hadn't made it all up, the love, the labor, the sacrifice. One morning, a neighbor knocked. An older woman, hunched slightly, but bright-eyed. She brought me a bowl of warm chai, said she noticed my lights on early, and figured I was a morning person like her. We sat and talked about nothing important, but the sound of another voice in my new space cracked something open in me. Later, I stood at the window and stared at the horizon for a long time. That evening, I made a decision. Not impulsive, not vengeful, just clear. I took the envelope with the original letter and walked to a nearby copy shop. I had them scan it. Print 2 copies, one for me, one for him. The next day I mailed it. No note, no return address. Just the words of our mother preserved printed, undeniable. I don't know if he opened it, or if his wife did and threw it away. Maybe it sat in their trash damp with coffee grounds. Maybe it sits in a drawer he can't bear to open. But I sent it, and that act, small private, felt more powerful than any court case could have. I didn't want the house. I wanted him to see what he had done, and what had been written not in ink, but in memory, in sacrifice, in silence. Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting his. I hesitated before opening it. My hands trembled the way they did that first day holding the eviction papers. Inside was one sentence. I didn't know she wrote you that. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just that. I held the paper over the sink for a long time, waiting to see if I'd cry. I didn't. I laughed instead, quietly, bitterly, because of course he didn't know. He hadn't asked, not once, and now it was too late, not to fix things, not to apologize, but to be the person who deserved that letter in the first place. I folded his note and placed it in the same velvet pouch, not out of sentimentality, but for completeness. I didn't need closure. I had already chosen peace, but I wanted to remember the exact moment when I stopped hoping. Because that moment, quiet, unremarkable, was when I came back to myself. I started volunteering at the community center down the street. It wasn't part of some grand healing plan. I just walked past one morning and saw a sign that read, "Help Needed Food Distribution." I stepped inside. The smell of rice and boiled cabbage reminded me of home, and the woman behind the desk didn't ask questions. She handed me a plastic apron and pointed me toward the back. That day, I packed 100 meals, chicken and rice, some tofu, a slice of orange, simple nourishing things. When I got home, my hands smelled like soy sauce and sanitizer. I fell asleep without needing tea or soft music. The next morning, I went back. People started learning my name. Not the name I'd carried like a badge in my family, the one that meant eldest caretaker keeper of the house. No, just my name, without weight. I met a boy named Mateo, maybe 7, who told me I had grandma hair and then hugged me like we'd known each other all his life. I met a woman named Clara who said she used to be a nurse but quit after her 3rd burnout. We sat on milk crates behind the center and traded stories about the worst hospital food we'd ever had. Every day I gave away food, and every day I got something back I didn't have a name for. It was here in this small, fluorescent lit room full of steam and laughter and broken English that I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. I had been waiting for an apology that would never come. And worse, I had built my silence around the hope that it would. I thought if I endured quietly, with grace, with sacrifice, someone would finally see. Finally say, you mattered. But in this space, no one knew what I'd lost. And somehow that made their kindness feel more honest. No one expected me to be the strong one. No one knew I had once been evicted from my own story. They just saw a woman who showed up, who washed rice laughed at jokes, and hugged children, and that was enough. One Thursday, Clara asked me if I had any family nearby. I paused before answering. I used to, I said, but it's complicated. She didn't press. She just nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. That night I walked home under the orange haze of street lamps. The wind had a bite to it, but I didn't pull my sweater tighter. I let it sting a little. There was a kind of truth in that sting, something that said, "You are here. You're still living, still whole even with the cracks." I stopped by a small bookstore and bought myself a new notebook. The cover was plain, soft blue, with no title. I liked that. At home, I sat by the window and opened to the first page. I didn't write about him, or the house, or the silence that followed me like a shadow for years. I wrote about Mateo's laugh, about Clara's hands, about the smell of rice vinegar and the way it clung to my sleeves. I wrote about the garden I wanted to grow in pots on my balcony herbs, first, maybe tomatoes, if I felt brave. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, not rebuilt, not redeemed, just present, still here, and that I realized was its own kind of miracle. On the third Sunday of the month, I visited the cemetery for the first time since I left the house. I hadn't planned to the idea, had lived in my chest for weeks, buried beneath obligations and emotional debris. But that morning, I woke up before dawn, dressed in black, and walked the long road to the resting place of my parents. I didn't bring incense, just a small bouquet of lilies I bought from the woman near the train station. White, clean, wordless. The cemetery was quiet. It always was. Even the birds seemed to fly around it rather than over. I remembered how my father used to say the peace had weight. I never understood him, not until that day, standing between their stones. The grass was trimmed. Someone had been here recently. Perhaps my brother. Perhaps the groundskeeper. I didn't care to guess. I knelt slowly. My knees weren't as forgiving as they once were. I traced my mother's name with 2 fingers. There was no rehearsed speech, no dramatic pause, just breath, presence. I sat there for a long time, watching the wind play in the trees, listening to the tiny movements of the earth insects in the roots leaves against granite. Then quietly, I spoke. I left. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. I left because I had to, not because I stopped loving this place, or you, but because staying meant erasing myself. The wind answered me with a soft hush. I wanted him to protect what we built. I wanted him to remember. He didn't, but I did. My throat tightened. I still do. I took the letter out, the one my mother had written me, folded gently in that same velvet pouch. I placed it between their graves, tucked just under the edge of the stone. It wouldn't last long. Rain would wash it away eventually, but it wasn't meant to be preserved. It was meant to be heard. I'm not angry anymore, I said, but I'm not coming back. Not to the house, not to the silence. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like boundary, a quiet claiming of space. As I stood up, I felt something shift inside me, a weight drop, as if I'd been carrying a suitcase I didn't know how to open. I walked home slowly, let the afternoon sun warm my face, bought sweet bread from a vendor and ate it standing on the sidewalk, smiled at a dog, waiting for its owner outside a cafe. When I reached my apartment, the air smelled different, fresher. Maybe it was just the flowers I'd left by the window. Maybe it was me. Later that evening, I received a message from an unknown number. Are you ever going to speak to me again? I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but I didn't type, because the answer wasn't yes or no. The answer was in every choice I'd made since leaving. I powered off the phone, sat by the window, watched the city's light spill across the floor like water, and whispered to the room I already did. I began spending more time at the library. It wasn't far from my apartment, just a short walk through 2 intersections and past the bakery that always smelled like honey and sesame. The library was small, not the grand kind with domes and marble, but quiet and lived in, like an old friend's living room. There, in the hush between shelves, I rediscovered the rhythm of being alone without being lonely. I read slowly, not to escape, but to remember how to inhabit a story that wasn't written in pain. One afternoon, I found a book on interior spaces, not about design, but about how people fill a room with meaning. The author said, "We don't decorate rooms. We forgive in them. We mourn in them. We come back to ourselves in them." I copied that line into my notebook and read it every morning for a week. I'd been afraid to make my apartment mine, as if doing so would be a betrayal of the place I'd left behind. But that sentence changed something. So I started with the curtains, pale green, soft to the touch, then a rug, a chipped ceramic lamp from a thrift shop, a plant that I named, even though I told myself I wouldn't. Her name is Lila. She leans toward the sun like she knows something I don't. And finally, I framed the family photo, not the one from the renovation, a different one, smaller, grainier. Just me and my parents sitting under the tamarind tree. My brother wasn't in it. He'd been away at school that year. I placed the frame beside my bed, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of the parts of love that hadn't been lost. Clara came by one Saturday, unannounced, holding a bag of lychees and a stack of her old medical journals. "You need more color in here," she said, then proceeded to arrange the fruit in a bowl I didn't know I had. We drank tea and talked about nothing and everything, politics the center, the absurdity of getting older. At one point, she asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" I didn't have to ask what she meant. I shook my head. Not even for closure, I smiled. Closure isn't a place, it's a choice. She nodded slowly. Good answer. After she left, I sat in the chair she'd just vacated, still warm, and stared out at the sky. The clouds were low and fast. A storm was coming, but the air inside felt steady. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept my brother's note. The one-sentence letter. I read it once. Then I tore it in half. And then in half again. It didn't feel like revenge. It didn't feel like erasure. It felt like permission to stop waiting for more, to stop rehearsing speeches that would never be heard, to stop tethering my healing to someone else's capacity to acknowledge harm. In that moment, I realized forgiveness isn't always a gift for the other person. Sometimes it's the act of unlocking your own cage. I didn't tell him. I didn't post anything cryptic or poetic online. I simply made a pot of soup, turned on the radio, and let the music fill the corners of a space that was finally, quietly mine. It was on a Tuesday of all days that the letter arrived again, with no return address, but I recognized the envelope. Same cream stock, same weight, same deliberate folds. I stood at the door holding it like it might vanish if I waited long enough. Part of me wanted to rip it open. Another wanted to throw it away unopened. I didn't do either. I placed it on the kitchen counter and made tea. I let the water boil over. Twice. When I finally opened it, I was careful, too careful, like it might be dangerous to know what was inside. 3 pages, handwritten, not typed. The first sentence stopped me. You're right, I didn't see it. I didn't want to. I read the rest in a single breath. He spoke of pressure, of being told to take care of things efficiently, of legal advisors and timelines and family expectations. He said he thought I'd understand. That I always understood. He didn't use the word sorry, not once, but there were lines that reached for it. I kept telling myself, you didn't really care about the house. You've always been the strong one. I assumed you'd land on your feet. I was wrong to assume. He included a photograph, one I'd never seen before. It was of the 2 of us, maybe ages 9 and 14, sitting on the roof of the house, our legs dangling, cheeks flushed. I was pointing at something off camera. He was looking at me like I knew the answer to everything. I held the photo in my lap for a long time. Then I put it back in the envelope, folded the letter, slid both into a drawer I rarely used. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I wasn't interested in reopening the bridge. I just wanted to stop carrying its rubble. The next day, I went to the market and bought paint. I chose a shade of blue that reminded me of the ocean I used to dream of when we were kids, when he would whisper plans about moving to America, and I'd imagine myself as the anchor while he became the wind. That was the deal, wasn't it? I stay. He flies. I never asked what happened when the anchor rusted. Back at home, I painted the living room wall. With slow, deliberate strokes, I covered the plain white with something that finally felt like voice. I hung nothing on it, left it bare, bold, honest. Some days later, I opened the notebook again. I wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be lived." And I believed it. I stopped checking the mail every morning. I stopped wondering whether he'd call, whether he'd ask to meet. I stopped looking back. Instead, I started thinking about planting mint on the windowsill. Maybe basil. I began bookmarking recipes. I invited Clara for dinner, not to talk about the past, but to cook something new. We laughed so hard over the soup that I had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe. And when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone who had been erased. I saw someone who had returned, not to a house, not to a brother, but to herself. I started calling myself by my full name again. For years, I had allowed it to be shortened, softened, clipped at the edges, like something too cumbersome to carry in full. At the center, it carried my grandmother's name, a quiet nod to a woman who once fought a landlord with her bare hands. Now, when I introduced myself at the community center or the library, I said it clearly, all 3 syllables, without apology. There's a strange power in reclaiming what was always yours. Clara noticed. "I like the way you say it now," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "Like you finally believe it belongs to you." I smiled. It does. We didn't need to say more. That evening, I lit a candle, not for mourning, for marking. 1 year had passed since the letter, the first one, the eviction. I sat by the window with my notebook and wrote a list, not of grievances, but of what I'd rebuilt quietly, invisibly, patiently. A home that smelled like lemongrass and ink. A bookshelf filled with voices I'd chosen. Friendships that asked nothing but presence. A body that finally rested. A name fully spoken. There were still echoes, of course. A scent would remind me of my mother. A phrase would sound like my father's. A face on the street might momentarily become my brother's before the light shifted. But the echoes didn't undo me anymore. They folded into the background like wind behind a song. One afternoon, I received an email from the law office that had handled the house transfer, a courtesy notice, they called it, an invitation to submit any remaining personal claims. I stared at it for a long time, then deleted it. I had no claims left, not legal, not emotional, not spiritual. What I had now could not be itemized. That night, I dreamed I was walking through a house made entirely of glass. The rooms were warm, filled with light. No locks, no corners, just endless reflection. In the dream, someone called my name, my full name, and I turned, not to answer, to arrive. I awoke before dawn, heart calm. For the first time in months, I didn't reach for the notebook. I didn't need to record the dream. It was already inside me. That day, I bought a new set of dishes, simple pale gray, a color that made no demands. I hosted dinner for 3 women from the center. They brought fruit laughter stories about their grandchildren. No one asked what I had lost. They just said thank you. And I said, "You're always welcome," and meant it. After they left, I washed the dishes slowly, not to prolong the moment, just because I could. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was earned. I poured myself tea, sat at the table, and didn't need to remember anything, because finally I was living forward. I received one more letter. This time it was from his wife. The handwriting was unfamiliar. At first, sharp-angled, precise. I turned the envelope over twice before opening it. No name on the front, just my address printed in black ink. Inside, there were 2 pages, folded neatly, no photo, no decoration. I hesitated before reading, bracing myself for the voice I had always found hard to stomach, clipped, polished, armored. But it began simply, "You don't know me. Not really. But I've watched you from a distance for years. I owe you a truth, even if it's late." I sat down slowly, let my fingers rest on the edge of the letter. When I first came into the family, I didn't understand your place. You were so silent, so efficient. I mistook that for control, for possessiveness. I saw how your presence made him small. Or maybe I just saw what he never wanted to live up to. My breath caught. He felt indebted to you in ways he couldn't say. It shamed him. You had built a life from ashes. He built a life from escape. I was the escape. I paused. The room had gone quiet. Even the city outside seemed to hold its breath. When the decision was made to transfer the house, I didn't protest. I told myself it was pragmatic, that you'd manage, that you always managed. But it wasn't pragmatic. It was cruel. And I saw it. I saw you. I just chose not to act. Tears welled before I gave them permission. You deserved better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know you were never invisible. You were inconvenient to the story we were trying to tell. So we tried to erase you. I am sorry. The final paragraph was signed not with her full name, but a simple M. I folded the letter gently, sat in silence. The apology, unexpected and uninvited, didn't feel like a knife. It felt like a gust of wind through a window I hadn't realized was open. I didn't cry out of anger or grief. I cried because someone had finally said the thing I wasn't sure anyone else saw. I had been inconvenient, and I had endured it with grace, thinking silence was nobility. But now I understood silence had been mistaken for consent. I burned the letter that night, not in rage, not in shame, but as a ritual. I whispered, "I release you," as the flame touched the page. Ash floated toward the ceiling like something holy. In the days that followed, I noticed small shifts in myself. The way I walked, shoulders lighter, the way I answered the phone, present, not guarded. I signed up for a poetry reading at the library, read one of my pieces aloud. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. People clapped. Some nodded. One woman reached for my hand afterward and said, "You wrote what I've lived." That night, I added something new to the notebook. Sometimes the person you become is born not from what you survived, but from what you chose to walk away from without an audience. I closed the book, turned out the light, and slept deeply without dreams. Spring arrived like a whisper, not a declaration. No sudden blooms or bold sunrises, just small things, the way the air softened in the morning, the return of the sparrows on the ledge, the slow unfurling of green on the trees lining the street below. I found myself waking earlier, not out of habit, but desire. I wanted to hear the city before it got loud. I wanted to sit by the window with my tea barefoot, wrapped in my shawl, and just exist without obligation. At the community center, I started a small writing group, just 5 women, different ages, different wounds. We met on Tuesdays, shared whatever we had, fragments of memory, unfinished poems, whispered letters never sent. We didn't critique, we bore witness. One of them, Amina, wrote a piece about tending to her mother's hair while she lay dying. Another, Teresa, wrote about the sound of her ex-husband's keys in the door and how she never knew whether to brace or breathe. I read them a piece I titled Inheritance. It wasn't about the house. It was about the way my mother's hands moved when she folded sheets, how my father carved soap into small animals when I was sick, how my brother used to hum the same lullaby under his breath when he thought no one was listening. After I finished reading, no one spoke. Amina reached across the table and placed her palm on mine. That was enough. Outside, the rain had begun again. I didn't have an umbrella. I didn't care. I walked home slowly, my shoes soaking hair plastered to my scalp. I laughed when a truck splashed water on my calves. Laughed like I hadn't in years, freely, without flinching, because somewhere between the grief and the rebuilding, I had become someone I didn't expect, someone unafraid of being seen. That night, I rearranged the apartment. Nothing drastic, just enough to feel movement. I shifted the reading chair closer to the window, moved the rug to the center, took the family photo from the drawer and placed it on the bookshelf, not to idolize the past, but to accept it. They belonged to me, even the ones who left, even the ones who let me go. I boiled water, prepared a pot of sweet black bean soup the way my mother had taught me, gently, patiently stirring in figure eights. I ate it slowly. Let each bite remind me that nourishment wasn't just food. It was language, company, stillness. It was the softness I had once reserved only for others, now returned to myself. Later, I sat by the open window and wrote in my notebook. I was never meant to prove my worth. I was meant to live it. Then I underlined it twice, not for emphasis, for remembrance. The phone rang just after noon. I almost didn't answer. It had been months since I'd heard from any number that wasn't a delivery service, the library, or the community center. But something in me said, pick up. His voice was unfamiliar at first, thinner, lower. Careful. It's me, he said. I know I shouldn't be calling. I didn't say anything. He paused. I could hear the echo of his breath through the line, the faint rustle of wind, maybe from a balcony, maybe from his car. I drove past the old house today, he said. They cut down the tamarind tree. My heart didn't ache. It didn't drop. It simply noted the fact. like news from a city I no longer lived in. They're repainting the walls. White. Everything white. Still, I said, nothing. He let the silence stretch. I know that doesn't matter to you anymore. I guess I just wanted to say it out loud, to someone who understands what it meant. I wanted to ask why now, but the answer didn't matter. He spoke again. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I know what I did. His voice cracked, then not fully, not dramatically, just a small break, like a window creaking under too much wind. I wanted to hear your voice. One more time. There it was. Not an apology, not a request, just need. Human. Small. I took a breath. I'm still alive, I said softly, but I'm not in that story anymore. He exhaled, a long, shaky sound. I know. I hope you find peace, I added. Not from me, just for you. Thank you, he whispered. That means more than you know. I didn't respond. I let the silence settle one last time between us, not as a wall, but as a quiet acknowledgement. Then I ended the call. I stood by the window for a while afterward. The sky had gone overcast, the kind of soft gray that muted everything. I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel victorious. I felt still. I made a cup of tea, sat at the table, stared at my plant, Lila still leaning toward the light, like she knew something I didn't. And then I did something I hadn't done since moving into this apartment. I sang, not a song of grief or memory, but one of no particular purpose, just notes rising and falling, my voice rough from disuse, but real. It filled the room, bounced off the walls, and returned to me, changed. When it ended, I laughed quietly. There was no applause, no witness, only me, and that was enough. A few days later, I received a parcel. Brown paper tied with twine. No note, no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind our father used to make in the shed behind the house. I recognized the joint's tongue and groove sanded smooth. It was empty except for a single object, my mother's pendant, the jade one she wore every Lunar New Year. I hadn't seen it in years. I thought it was lost or sold. I held it in my palm, let it warm against my skin. It still smelled faintly of her rose oil and temple incense. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, fingers curled around it, pulse steady. I didn't ask how he found it, whether he'd had it all this time or gone looking for it. I didn't need to know, because for once it wasn't about explanation. It was about recognition. He hadn't written anything, but the gesture was loud in its quiet, not a plea, not a repair, just a return, and somehow that mattered more. I placed the pendant on the windowsill beside the plant, not on an altar, not in a box, just there in the light. Clara noticed it a few days later. That's beautiful, she said. I nodded. It belonged to someone who taught me how to stay soft without disappearing. She smiled. That's rare. I didn't answer, just poured her more tea. That evening after she left, I took out my notebook and wrote a letter. Not one I intended to send, just one I needed to write. Dear Mother. He sent it back. The pendant, the one you wore with pride and without apology. I placed it in the sun today. I think it still remembers your skin. He's not who I thought he'd be. But then again, neither am I. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't owe each other sameness, just truth. I think you'd be proud. Not because I stayed quiet, but because I finally learned when not to. I closed the notebook gently. Outside, the sky was turning that deep blue just before dusk, the color that doesn't ask for your attention, it just arrives. I lit a candle, not for mourning, for thanks, for the women who came before me, for the girl I used to be, for the woman I'd become walking out of houses that never knew how to keep her. That night, I slept with the window open, the breeze touching my cheek like a hand I almost remembered. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamed of a table wide full of light and a seat already waiting for me. Summer came slowly, like someone unsure if they were welcome. The air grew thick, the evenings stretched longer, and the sound of children returning home from school returned to the streets, like a song I'd almost forgotten. My balcony garden began to flourish, mint basil, even a tomato plant that leaned so far toward the sunlight, I had to tie it gently to a wooden stick for support. I joked to Clara that we were growing in the same direction. One Sunday morning, I hosted a meal. Nothing elaborate, just soup and rice, pickled vegetables, tea that steeped too long. 4 women from the writing group came. They brought Mango's old poems and stories they hadn't planned to tell. We ate slowly. No phones, no clocks. Afterward, we sat in a circle on the floor knees, touching stories weaving together without beginning or end. Amina read a piece called The Room I Never Left. It wasn't about a place. It was about a silence, the kind that builds its own furniture. When she finished, no one clapped. We just sat with it. Then Teresa asked if I'd ever considered writing a book. I laughed. About what she tilted her head. About this, what it's like to be erased, and then to write yourself back. Her words stayed with me long after the evening ended. That night, I pulled out every page I'd written since I moved in. I laid them out on the floor, scraps, notebooks, envelopes, napkins, from cafes. There were so many, and none of them were angry. They were clear. I began organizing them, not by time, but by temperature. The cold days, the warm ones, the ones where memory burned like a fever. It wasn't a book yet, but it was a body of work, a body of self. That week, I registered for a local seminar, Writing Through Grief. Not to attend, to teach. The director asked for a short bio. I wrote daughter of a quiet house, sister to silence, student of absence, lover of sunlit kitchens and over-steeped tea, rights to remember, rights to stay. I signed my full name, no abbreviations. I printed it, framed it, hung it by the door, not for visitors, for me, to remind myself who I was when no one was looking. The day of the seminar, I wore a simple white blouse and my mother's pendant. I didn't prepare slides, just stories. When I stood at the front of the room, I looked out at the small group of women, eyes wide, notebooks open. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence settle. Then I said, today, we're not here to fix anything. We're here to remember who we were before the forgetting began. Someone in the back nodded. Someone near the front wiped her eyes. I breathed in and began. The seminar lasted 6 weeks, each session more intimate than the last. We didn't just write, we unwound. We spoke names that hadn't been said aloud in years. We opened journals and old wounds with equal care. Some women cried, some laughed. All of us in our own way rebuilt something. At the end of the final session, I brought in a kettle of ginger tea and a stack of blank postcards. I told them to write one thing they would take with them, one line they'd carry forward. Teresa wrote, I am no longer someone who waits to be invited. Amina wrote, my silence was not weakness. It was my breath held too long. I wrote, the house is gone, but the woman remains. We pinned them to the wall, side by side, a patchwork of reclaimed voices. After everyone left, I stood alone in the center of the room. It smelled like paper and cinnamon. I looked at those postcards and felt a strange kind of pride. Not the boastful kind, the quiet, steady kind that grows from work done in the dark. On the walk home, the air was thick with the scent of night jasmine. I paused by the fence where it grew wild and crushed a bloom between my fingers. The smell wrapped around me like a memory, soft, ghosted, familiar. When I reached my apartment, the answering machine blinked. One message. I hadn't checked it in weeks. I pressed play. It was him. His voice was quieter than before, worn down at the edges. I sold the house, he said. Not for the money. I couldn't stand walking through it anymore. Every corner reminded me of what I did, or didn't do. Pause. I know it's not enough, but I wanted you to know I'm using the money to start something. A fund for caregivers, for people who stay. Another pause. I put your name on it, quietly. No plaques, no headlines. Just there. Silence. Then the message ended. I stood very still. The room was warm, dim, silent again. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt seen. Not in the way I once longed for grand gestures, family reconciliation, teary apologies, but in a way that mattered more. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for re-entry. He did what I never thought he would. He listened. I didn't call him back. Instead, I wrote his name, first name, only on the last page of my notebook, not out of sentimentality, out of completion. The next morning, I sat on the balcony beside Lila. She had grown taller than the railing now, leaves thick, confident. I sipped tea, opened a new notebook, wrote on the first line, "This story doesn't begin in a house. It begins in a woman." And then, without hesitation, I kept writing, because I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. I was writing toward a life that was finally, fully mine. Autumn arrived like a second breath, softer, more deliberate. The mornings were cooler now. I pulled out the shawl I'd tucked away in spring and wrapped it around my shoulders as I sat on the balcony, watching the world shift. Lila had started to brown at the edges, leaves curling toward themselves. I didn't panic. I pruned, gently watered. Les gave her space. Growth, I was learning, also meant knowing when to let go. The seminar had ended, but the women still gathered. Once a month, potluck-style rotating. Homes. They insisted on meeting at mine, for the next one said, my walls felt safe. I said yes, not because I felt ready, but because I no longer believed in waiting for the perfect moment to open my door. I began preparing, early cleaned the windows, baked a pear tart that came out lopsided but fragrant, rearranged the chairs in a loose circle. I placed the framed family photo back on the shelf. I no longer feared its presence. It was history, not a verdict. That evening, the apartment filled with voices, laughter music. Someone played on their phone. Someone brought wine. Someone else brought old heartbreak. It all belonged. At one point, Teresa pulled me aside, placed a hand on my shoulder. You've built something here, she said. Something that didn't exist before you. I nodded, emotion rising, but I didn't cry. I just looked around at the people in my home and let the truth settle, like warm light. Later, alone again, I washed the dishes by hand. The smell of soap and spices lingered in the air. I looked around the room, at the pale green curtains, the rug I once questioned the table, now covered with empty glasses and crumbs and joy. It didn't look like the house I grew up in. It looked like me. That night I wrote again, not in the notebook, on the wall calendar above my desk, just one word, stay. Not a command, a reminder. Stay with myself. Stay in this life I'd reclaimed. Stay in the small, beautiful ordinaries that built something no betrayal could ever undo. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to explain the past. I had survived it, rewritten it, replanted it, and I was still here, still writing, still opening the window each morning, still loving what remained. Some things, I suppose, will never be returned. The years I gave, without question. The versions of myself I lost in service of being needed. The house once full of warmth, now repainted, resold, rewritten. But what still remains is quieter, truer. I no longer look for apologies in places already emptied. I no longer shape my days around absence. Instead, I make tea. I open the window. I let the light in without asking who it belongs to. I no longer measure worth by how long I stayed. I measure it by how deeply I know myself now. And that is the greater inheritance. Because what greed tried to take dignity restored. What was erased, I rewrote not in anger but in presence. And the woman who once lived in the shadow of loyalty now lives in the soft, wide sun of her own choosing. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if this story moved you. Share your voice. It matters.